It is all becoming one big story, isn't it? Natural resources, geopolitics, the military, the economy, the supply chain, even deep-sea mining, the environment, ESG, and its changing nature. In a world of resource scarcity, hello and welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast. My name's Adrian Pocobelli. And so we're starting to get clarity here, but I want to emphasize just starting to get clarity on the whole rare earth deal between the United States and China. There have been a lot of claims last show, as we heard, from the United States basically saying we're going back to late 2023 before the controls that were introduced in April, and of course before the controls that were introduced on October 9th. Now, there is some evidence for that, but I think it's all theoretical until we actually see deliveries, isn't it? And we're still unclear on what was given to China. I mean, there was a story in the Taipei Times. On October 23rd, the story came out, F-16V jet delivery unlikely by next year. And that is according to the Air Force in Taiwan. Taiwan would not receive all 66 F-16 Block 70 jets it purchased from the United States by the end of next year, as originally scheduled due to labor shortages and supply chain disruptions, Air Force Chief of Staff Li Qingjian said today, and that is, of course, on October 23rd. So one wonders, is this something that was given to China ahead of time? And also, do they simply not have the rare earths? Like maybe it's all just what it is. They have supply chain disruptions. So that was an interesting story to come across. Of course, there's also a big story in the New York Times on how this is impacting Europe's military buildup, something we've been discussing here since August, if not earlier, which is how does Europe build its military with no rare earths? Well, the New York Times has finally put out an article on this on November 6th, so late last week on Thursday. So we're getting all sorts of headlines here, so let's go to the issue of the moment. What is actually going on here in this deal between China and the United States on rare earths? And we have a story on November 8th from Reuters via mining.com. China starts working on easing rare earth export rules, but short of Trump hopes. So you see it in the headline. China starts working on easing rare earth export rules, but short of Trump hopes. So they are beginning to think about it. They are beginning to do something. China has begun designing a new rare earth licensing regime that could speed up shipments, but it is unlikely to amount to a complete rollback of restrictions as hoped by Washington, industry insiders said. The Ministry of Commerce told some rare earth exporters they will be able to apply for new streamlined permits in the future, and in industry briefings outlined the documents that will be required, two sources familiar with the matter said. The export curbs have become Beijing's most potent source of leverage in its trade rivalry with Washington, as China produces over 90% of the world's processed rare earths and rare earth magnets, vital in products ranging from cars to missiles. Following the agreement reached between President Donald Trump and Xi Jinping, China said last week it would pause for 1 year the restrictions it imposed in October. However, China's Commerce Ministry has said nothing publicly about a broad round of controls introduced in April that rattled global supply chains. The White House said on Saturday that China had agreed to introduce general licenses and characterize such permits as the de facto end of China's rare earth export controls. So that is discussing the previous Saturday, before this article came out on Thursday. In private, Chinese officials have said they are working on the licenses, three other sources briefed on discussions said, although one said it would take months. However, other industry insiders said the new licenses do not mean China's wide-ranging rare earth export controls introduced in April have been removed. China's Ministry of Commerce did not immediately respond to questions from Reuters. And then there's speculation from the sources. The new licenses would be valid for a year and probably allow larger export volumes, the first two sources said. Companies are preparing documents which will require more information from customers, they said. The sources said they expect more clarity by the end of the year. Some Chinese rare earth companies said they have not yet been informed of the change. General licenses will likely be harder to acquire for users associated with defense or other sensitive areas, some industry sources said. All sources spoke on condition of anonymity given the sensitivity of the matter. So that is how it started. And we also had a similar report from the New York Times on November 7th. China suspends some export controls on critical minerals, but retains others. And we have a couple of quotes here. So here's the White House statement on November 1st, shortly after the meeting. Quote, "The general license means the de facto removal of controls China imposed since 2023. So that is interesting. And then we had an announcement on Sunday. So this is posted on November 9th, and that is Sunday. China lifts export ban on gallium, germanium, and antimony to United States. This is by a staff writer at mining.com. China has lifted a nearly year-long ban on exports of gallium, germanium, and antimony to the U.S. in a further de-escalation of trade tensions between the two world's largest economies. So this would go even further back than the April restrictions. In a statement issued on Sunday, China's Commerce Ministry said it will pause its export ban on these minerals and related end-use items for about 1 year. The ban was first imposed in December 2024 in retaliation for U.S. export controls on high-bandwidth memory chips into China toward the end of the Biden administration. The U.S. considers all three minerals to be critical to its national security and economy. Gallium and germanium are both essential for semiconductors, with the former also used in advanced radar technology and the latter in infrared technology, fiber optic cables, and solar cells. Antimony is widely used in military applications such as flame retardants and primers for ammunition. In a statement, the Chinese Commerce Ministry said the suspension of its 2024 export curbs will take place until November 27, 2026, without providing further details. So, interesting development there. And another headline, this is Scott Bezent on Fox Business. Bezent says new rare earth factory will cut costs, break China's chokehold on industry. So Scott Bezent is celebrating a company called EVAC, EVAC, and their new rare earth magnet processing center in Sumter, South Carolina. Quote, "This is the first magnet made in the U.S. in 25 years. We're ending China's chokehold on our supply chain," Bezent said at EVAC's new rare earth magnet processing center in Sumter. Quote, "We're finally becoming independent again, thanks to companies like EVAC." So it's going to be interesting to see. I mean, some people are saying 8 to 12 years. Can they do it in a year? It's a real test of the system, one could argue. So American ingenuity is really being put to the test here on this whole rare earth issue. Another headline, Trump meets Central Asian leaders to boost critical mineral ties. This is November 7th. So we're getting multiple headlines a day from the top people in the U.S. administration, including the president, on natural resources. Historic times in the mining sector. And this is Reuters. U.S. President Donald Trump on Thursday called critical minerals a key priority as he hosted the leaders of 5 Central Asian nations at the White House, emphasizing his administration's efforts to expand and secure U.S. supply chains through new global agreements. The meetings with leaders of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan came as Washington seeks to expand its influence in a resource-rich region long dominated by Russia and increasingly courted by China. Trump called Central Asia, quote, "an extremely wealthy region," saying he wants to make America's partnership with the 5 countries stronger. Quote, "One of the key items of our agenda is critical minerals. In recent weeks, my administration has strengthened American economic security by forging agreements with allies and friends across the world to broaden our critical mineral supply chains." So more deals with Asian nations and the United States. Also in Asia, Japan, U.S. consider rare earth mining near Minamotori in Pacific. PM Takaichi says, that's also Reuters, on November 6th, so Thursday. Japan and the United States will jointly study developing rare earth mining in the waters around Minamotori Island in the Pacific, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi said on Thursday. Co-development of rare earth minerals was a key topic in her meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump last week, Takaichi told a parliamentary session. So this has to do with deep-sea mining. As it says here, surveys have confirmed the presence of rich rare earth mud at depths of 5,000 to 6,000 meters, with Japan's exclusive economic zone near Minamotori Island, according to an executive with a government-backed project. If the initial tests are successful, the project aims to launch trial operations of a system capable of recovering 350 metric tons of mud per day from January 2027. Now another huge story, this time from the New York Times, on a subject we've been discussing here for months, which is how the stranglehold or choking of supplies of rare earth minerals to Europe is affecting their attempt to build up their military. And here on November 6th, how China's rare earth chokehold could strangle Europe's military buildup. This is by Jana Smialek at the New York Times. European governments are racing to rearm their militaries as they face up to a more aggressive Russia and an increasingly isolationist America. But that push must overcome a formidable roadblock in the shape of China's restrictions on critical minerals. Scrolling down, the drama has spurred a flurry of action in Europe, with Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, the EU's executive arm, urging the bloc to, quote, strive for its independence on the critical minerals. But in the meantime, European trade officials have been frantically engaging with their Chinese counterparts to try to secure the bloc's supply. And if you've been listening to this show, we've been covering that quite closely. On Wednesday, ambassadors from across the 27 EU nations were told that China appeared to be willing to negotiate so-called general licenses to streamline rare earth exports to Europe. But there was no guarantee that such a solution would come quickly or last for long. The bloc is focused on finding alternative supply options, said two diplomats briefed on the discussions who asked for anonymity to discuss internal deliberations. In the short term, the goal in the negotiations is to, quote, provide more certainty to European industries, said Olaf Gill, a spokesman for the European Commission. Quote, engagement continues. Yet the twists and turns have made it clear to European leaders just how much their military buildup hinges on an increasingly unreliable relationship with China. Quote, everything hangs on this, said Joris Tier, a researcher at the EU Institute for Security Studies, the European Union's think tank for security policy. Without a flow of critical minerals, he said, quote, there is no rearmament. So we've been seeing a lot of circumstantial evidence of this since at least August, if not earlier. So it's quite interesting here, November 6th, to see the New York Times reporting on this. And scrolling down, analysts at the consulting firm SFA Oxford recently predicted in a research note that, quote, full diversification from China would take 8 to 12 years, given how long it takes to develop mines, construct refineries, expand manufacturing, and work into the NATO supply chain. And when it comes to the defense industry, Europe doesn't have that kind of time. European nations are scrambling to raise their spending on defense sharply as they try to develop key capabilities by 2030. To that end, the European Union has loosened budget rules and rolled out a $172 billion loan program to help fuel military outlays. A lack of access to critical minerals could disrupt that initiative, tilt the scales of geopolitics, and shape Europe's future. Quote, autonomy in defense begins with autonomy in materials, said Daniel Fiat, the head of Defense and Statecraft Program at Vrije Universiteit Brussels, a university in Brussels. Rare earth minerals are key in F-35 jets, drones, submarines, Tomahawk missiles, radar systems, and other military technologies that are made in either the United States or the European Union, and which Europe has been planning to stockpile as part of its rearmament plans. Quote, the endgame of China here is to slow down the advancement of the United States and Europe by connection, said Benedetta Girardi, an analyst at the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, a think tank. Quote, if it hits the security sector of one, it also hits the security sector of the other. Quote, I'm still concerned, said Gracelyn Baskarin, director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a think tank. Quote, even a pause in restrictions leaves us precarious. She said that Europe, the United States, and their allies are not yet at the point where they can quickly replace the dysprosium in drone motors, for instance. The world also has no real alternative to China's supply of samarium, a rare earth mineral crucial for magnets that can withstand high temperatures in advanced military gear. And finally, we have another quote from Mr. Tier of the EU Institute for Security Studies. Quote, the Chinese are attempting to pull the rug from underneath the entire rearmament. It's not something that, as a defense official or an industry, you want to say out loud. And so perhaps this is why it has taken so long for this article to come out. And we also got a story In DW on November 1st, German defense industry hit by rare earth supply risks. The Federation of German Industries stated, quote, "The new rules can be seen as a direct attack on the rearmament of the West." Scrolling down, how is the German defense industry responding? Quote, "There is no panic in the industry," Hans-Christoph Atzpodian, CEO of the German Security and Defense Industry Association, told DW. Compared to other industries, Atzpodian pointed out the defense industry uses, quote, "relatively small quantities of rare earths." Furthermore, companies have taken precautions so they will not have to restrict production in the coming months. However, experts still see a real risk of supply bottlenecks. Quote, "When push comes to shove, the big question is where defense companies will get alternatives, and things are looking really bleak in that regard," said Jacob Kulik, political scientist at the Chemnitz University of Technology. Another headline, U.S. names samarium as most vulnerable critical mineral. That's Noel Fletcher at Forbes. And also the Financial Times, the editorial board, putting out a piece, How to Curb China's Grip on Rare Earths. And that's in fact what we discuss here this episode as we discuss the Canadian budget and the strategies that could be employed in order to build out a mineral supply chain and how to do it. And it seems to me, after talking to Ron Birnbaum, who's going to be on this week's Spotlight, of course, founder and CEO of Pear Tree Canada, and Ian London, executive director of the Canadian Critical Minerals and Materials Alliance, that the way to go about this is actually to first get the experts involved so that you know which projects to develop. And once you get the A-teams of the industry involved, then you can start to pick and choose. But there's a lot of concern right now that, say, Ian London would say, like, what we can't do is just do everything, because we may end up with not very much. And so we have to pick and choose the projects and then perhaps build the processing capacity around those projects. So start from the ground up, so to speak. So quite interesting. And that is not mentioned in this editorial. It basically says we all need to work together. So it seems to me the missing link in the FT editorial board's piece is bringing in the experts. It mentions faster approval times, capital expenditure, price floors. But what it really needs, what this all hinges on, I would argue, are experts to pick the right projects. As Ian London points out, should Canada be developing rare earths? Should Canada be developing lithium? It's an interesting question. What should Canada be developing? What are the strengths? Final story here, as we finish our introduction, we have a big story out of Al Jazeera. Is Mali about to fall to Al-Qaeda affiliate JNIM? And this is by Shola Lawal at Al Jazeera. So, of course, we know Mali from the Lulo-Gounkoto complex and Barrick Mining's trials and tribulations there. And so here's the story. A months-long siege on the Malian capital, Bamako, by the armed al-Qaeda affiliate group Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam wal-Muslimin, or JNIM, has brought the city to a breaking point, causing desperation among residents and, according to analysts, placing increasing pressure on the military government to negotiate with the group, something it has refused to do before now. JNIM's members have created an effective economic and fuel blockade by sealing off major highways used by tankers to transport fuel from neighboring Senegal and the Ivory Coast to the landlocked Sahel country since September. While JNIM has long laid siege to towns in other parts of the country, this is the first time it has used the tactic on the capital city. The scale of the blockade and the immense effect it has had on the city is a sign of JNIM's growing hold over Mali and a step towards the group's stated aim of government change in Mali, Beverly Ochang, Sahel analyst with the intelligence firm Control Risks, told Al Jazeera. For weeks, most of Bamako's residents have been unable to buy any fuel for cars or motorcycles as supplies have dried up, bringing the normally bustling capital to a standstill. Many have waited in long fuel queues. Last week, the United States and the United Kingdom both advised their citizens to leave Mali and evacuated non-essential diplomatic staff. Other Western nations have also advised their citizens to leave the country. Schools across Mali have closed and will remain shut until November 9th as staff struggle to commute. Power cuts have intensified. So, a big story out of Mali. And finally, Javier Blas, columnist at Bloomberg, putting out a tweet. Huge news in the world of ESG. Norway will effectively pause ethical divestments by its oil-funded more than $2 trillion sovereign wealth fund and suspended the work of the fund's ethics advisor for 1 year while it rewrites the rules. Another huge theme in this industry, we talked ESG nonstop from 2016 basically to 2021 at every conference. It was the main focus. So this is big news as the world hits a huge wave of resource nationalism and scarcity. Even when we think of the rare earths, we are seeing a transformation in ESG and how it is being approached in light of that context. Quite fascinating. So we have a fabulous episode ahead of us. We have Ian London, Executive Director of the Canadian Critical Minerals and Materials Alliance, in an extended interview on what he sees as the main pressure points and what should happen strategically in Canada and around the world in terms of approaching this issue of securing minerals and materials for the supply chain. And also Ron Birnbaum, founder and CEO of Pear Tree Canada, who discusses the Government of Canada's recently tabled budget on November 4th and what he thinks about how they are approaching this development and push for critical minerals. If you want to find us online, you can find us at northernminer.com. You can find us on X at Northern Miner. You can find us on Instagram at The Northern Miner and on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where we also host these podcasts and wherever podcasts are available, including Spotify, SoundCloud, and Apple Podcasts. And with that, let's turn to Ron Birnbaum, founder and CEO of Pear Tree Canada, for this week's Spotlight. Joining us today, I'm pleased to welcome back to the Northern Miner podcast, Ron Birnbaum, founder and CEO of Pear Tree Canada. Ron, it's a delight to have you back. I always enjoy our conversations.
As do I, Adrian. Thank you for having me back.
It is an absolute pleasure. Now, of course, big news on the Canadian government front. We have a federal budget that was tabled on November 4th. A lot of headlines came that a lot of money was going to be dedicated to mining. We've discussed here in the past government policy towards mining, tax incentives. What are your thoughts in regard to the government's new budget and how it relates to the mining sector?
I think the budget, sweet and sour. There were some incentives that were built in that will be taken advantage of. Clean energy, for example. I think the forestry industry, but for mining and especially for exploration, on the exploration file, the budget was, in my view, very disappointing and doesn't achieve anything for what we need to get achieved in terms of more exploration, especially for critical minerals. And that's unfortunate.
Very interesting. So, in a sense, what was the issue? Was it the sense that the government is taking more of a stronger role, say, than the public markets? What is your concern with what you saw in the budget?
They made a lot about, they talked a little about how they've extended some of the tax credits. That's a good thing. They should be built in. They shouldn't have to be extendable in the first place. That's a different argument. They should just be built into the Income Tax Act and be done with it. And that's for taking high risk in exploration. They did add new additional targets for exploration that is subject to the tax credit. But a lot of them are byproducts. I don't think anybody goes hunting for tungsten or manganese. They're generally byproducts of other things. So I'm not sure that's going to add anything, but it sounds good. The disappointment is that tax incentives only work if they're accessible, if you can actually take that incentive. And there's a regime that's been around since 1987 called the Alternative Minimum Tax Regime, which limits the use of the deductions. Even though you're otherwise entitled to them, the idea is that the government you can't reduce your taxable income down to nil and not pay anything. There's an alternative calculation where they back out certain expenses. And unfortunately, Canadian exploration expenses are one of those things they back out. If you're subject to AMT, and 90% of everyone who funds exploration in Canada is subject to AMT, so a lot of these incentives are worthless. They sound good, but they don't have any impact. And that's unfortunate. We had lobbied for and thought there was some movement back in 2024. We saw draft legislation that would have, had they implemented what was tabled in 2024 that had fallen off the table when Parliament was prorogued, would add about $400 million of exploration capital in an industry that historically everybody knows is starved for capital. That was a big disappointment for me, that what was already decided on was walked back by a government that purports to want to be a catalyst for investment I think you hit it on the head when you said this government's more interested in making its own, taxing people and have the government make the decisions as opposed to the mining industry or the exploration industry convincing investment bankers that they're prepared to put up a bought deal because they've got something in the ground that's worthwhile.
Very interesting. So, what do you see as the direct impact of this policy should the budget go through?
I think the budget will go through. I think they'll find that vote. I think there wasn't anything that was so controversial that they won't get it through. Look, it's not a further erosion. It's just lots of lost opportunity. That opportunity in line with what the government said it wanted to achieve. So I don't quite understand it. This little AMT change is like literally demonstrably $400 million of accretive capital a year. The other thing that was very disappointing is the definition of Canadian exploration expenses. There was a case decided by the Supreme Court of British Columbia in Seabridge that basically said that all expenses up until the time you make a decision to build a mine are furtherance of exploration should be deductible as Canadian exploration expense under the flow-through regime. Right line test, very simple to understand. The government lost that case. The CRA lost that case because Seabridge was right that they had spent money on studies and otherwise that they said is in furtherance of exploration, that they're determining the quality and size of the resource. And NRCan, back in this past summer at their annual meeting, had their standing committee on finance, estimated that adopting Seabridge, which was an interpretation of the Income Tax Act, by the way, would add $500 million a year to the capital base in Canada. You would think that's what the government would want. And instead, you see Seabridge limited in this budget specifically. It's, as one very senior person said, and I didn't say it, but, it's like CRA is sore losers. And so we'll show you, boy, right? It's too bad it's not the other way around, and that's the expansion of the capital base. The last thing I think that we were hopeful for, that we had lobbied for, more for the mining sector than the exploration subsector, was the ability to fund mine development using Canadian Development Expense Shares, CDE, flow-through shares. Again, capital is always short. This is, in most years, mining and exploration is you're almost guaranteed to lose money. You really have to be either really smart money or very patient money, but you don't see the run-ups that you see in other sectors. So we thought the government had bought into this as well, that you could fund capital equipment for mine building. The flow-through regime is very self-limiting. You couldn't buy, your next 5 years and get everybody to write off 5 years worth of capital. You have to actually spend it. Like you actually would have had to deploy it within 2 years of the fundraising. We thought that was also reasonable. And we also thought that was within the rubric and intent of government in terms of acting as catalyst. That word they've used a lot. And maybe the expectation was that the government would follow through on that language and on that intent. And they certainly haven't, at least from my very limited perspective.
Okay, super interesting. Because again, we read these headlines and it sounds like all is well and all this money is going to be flowing into the mining sector. And in a sense, it will, but it's from a different source, in a sense, or with different incentives. So as we wrap up here, Ron, what would you like to see? Boil it down. We have some policymakers that listen to the show. What would you like them to know, and what should they know, and how should they do this from your perspective as someone who's been doing this for decades, founder of Pear Tree Canada?
One of the challenges, I think, is whenever you have a tax incentive, I think from the perspective of the Department of Finance, in fairness to the Department of Finance, they haven't quantified how much is lost in tax revenue, how much activity will it generate. And it's on our website. Going back, I think, 10, 12 years, we commissioned a report from Deloitte saying $1 of flow-through funds $1 of economic activity. If the company doesn't spend the money, the deduction by the subscriber is reassessed. Holistically, one deduction is offset by somebody else's inclusion. Do a cost-benefit analysis and see the net cost to the Treasury. NRCan did it 40 years ago and found it was nil. We did it, and looking at I think we could only look at about 35% of all the expenditures. And our study, the Deloitte study on our website, said the cost of, the incentive like 14% or something. And that was only looking at a third of the expenses. I think sometime they're going to have to look at cost benefit. If they look at the benefit, they see it's greater than the cost. I think that The challenge for everybody is that government likes to be hierarchical, especially this government, I think. Tax the population and make the investment decisions, I think, is sort of the mindset of this government. Flow through shares is much like peer-to-peer computing. You set up a set of rules and let Bay Street and the mining companies all decide how that money is going to be, deployed and where it's going to be deployed. The rules are very direct and very simple. They should be very simple and direct. That's a lost opportunity in Seabridge. It was a very clean, right line discussion as to what constitutes an exploration expense that would have added greater certainty and a lot more money into the marketplace. And that's what we needed. Instead, we got cynically shut down on Seabridge. It makes no sense to me. I don't think it makes any sense to anybody in the mining and exploration tax community.
Okay, excellent. So if someone from the government wants to reach out to you, should they just go to your website? How do they do that?
We're not shy, and our phone numbers are on the website and contact stuff is there by all means. By the way, the Department of Finance has we are registered lobbyists. We've written about this a lot. I think you may remember Kendra Johnson ran our sort of the GR side of the business. She's now an Assistant Deputy Minister of Mining for British Columbia. Our loss, but British Columbia's gain. So it's great. But me or somebody else will, we're always happy to talk policy and always happy to help if we can.
Ron Birnbaum, founder and CEO of Pear Tree Canada, thank you for joining us and sharing all of your perspective and insights on this week's Northern Miner podcast.
Thanks.
And thank you once again to Pear Tree Canada for sponsoring this week's episode of the Northern Miner podcast. If you want to learn more, visit peartreecanada.com. Turning to the website. Barrick hikes dividend, shifts focus to North America as gold prices bolster profit. And this is Reuters via mining.com. Barrick Mining on Monday raised its dividend and expanded its share buyback program after reporting an adjusted quarterly profit that beat estimates as stronger gold prices helped offset a decline in production. The Canadian Miners' interim CEO, Mark Hill, told Reuters that its focus in the future will be, quote, firmly on North America, because it is our next growth area and it is the next growth in gold as well, so that is what we are focused on going forward. The miner jointly owns Nevada Gold Mines with Newmont and is also looking to develop the 4 Mile gold mine in Nevada. Barrick shares rose nearly 6% in early trading on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Barrick, the third largest gold miner by production, has had a volatile year, marked by the loss of control of its gold mine in Mali, which led to a $1 billion write-off of the asset, and the exit of Mark Bristow as its chief executive officer. The Barrick Board Search Committee, led by independent director Brett Harvey, is working to find a new president and CEO, the company said in a statement. In Mali, 4 of Barrick's employees are in jail over a dispute with the company over the country's new mining tax code. Hill said the main focus is to get the employees out of jail, adding that the company has to change some of the ways it is approaching the issue. Barrick also filed for arbitration against Mali, though the recent hearings over the company's request for an urgent hearing over the dispute were rejected by the World Bank's dispute tribunal. Quote, "We agree that arbitration, while an option, it is probably not a preferred option and is not going to resolve the problem of the people who are incarcerated in the short term," Hill said. Scrolling down, Barrick said its average realized gold price rose to $3,457 per ounce during the third quarter, from $2,494 per ounce a year earlier. Its quarterly production decreased to 829,000 ounces from 943,000 ounces last year. The company's all-in sustaining costs for gold, an industry metric reflecting total expenses, rose to $1,538 per ounce from $1,507 per ounce during the third quarter. Barrick declared a 25% rise in its quarterly dividend to $1.25 per share and announced that its board had approved a $500 million increase to the existing share repurchase program. So, interesting developments at Barrick. They are running out of time as their mining license, from what I understand, expires in February. Continuing on, Newmont restructuring impacted 16% of workforce, this by a staff writer at mining.com. Newmont's restructuring plan after its acquisition of Newcrest Mining has impacted around 16% of its entire workforce, according to a memo seen by Reuters. In late August, Bloomberg reported that the world's largest gold miner would carry out a sweeping restructuring plan following its $17 billion buy of Australia's Newcrest in 2023. The plan, reflecting Newmont's efforts to streamline operations and integrate the two companies, could lead to thousands of job losses, Bloomberg said. Citing a company memo, Reuters said the project has led to various job eliminations, unfilled vacancies, and changes to role levels at Newmont. In the final stage of the restructuring, the company reduced roles by roughly 12% at its level of work 2, which covers superintendents, leads, and specialists, and by around 10% at level of work 1, including advisors, officers, operators, and maintainers. Newmont's employees were also told that the restructuring was completed a month ahead of schedule to ease concerns about prolonged uncertainty, Reuters added. So the restructuring seems to be complete at Newmont. And just a headline here, China's central bank buys gold for 12th straight month. And you can read that on mining.com. And that is Reuters. And another gold headline, gold prices seen topping $5,000 by end of 2026, JP Morgan says. And scrolling down a bit, prices could reach $5,200 to $5,300 by the end of 2026. Alex Wolf, the firm's global head of macro and fixed income strategies, said in an interview. That would be more than 25% higher than where the metal is currently trading. So more bullish predictions on gold, which has recovered quite nicely, as we're going to see in metal prices, as has silver. Continuing on, London bullion vaults see historic inflows after silver squeeze. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com on November 10th. Silver held in London vaults swelled by the largest amount in at least 9 years, easing an extreme squeeze that sent prices soaring over metal stored in Shanghai and New York. Vaults underpinning the London market added nearly 54 million troy ounces of silver in October, an amount weighing more than 100 of the UK's capital iconic double-decker buses. It was drawn to London by a historic arbitrage opportunity caused by market tightness, pulling stocks out of warehouses elsewhere. Silver inventories in London hit an all-time low earlier this year after tariff fears sparked a massive outflow of the metal to New York. When a spike in Indian demand as well as a wave of buying for silver-backed exchange-traded funds hit the market in early October, there wasn't enough silver left to meet demand, sending the benchmark spot price soaring as much as $3 an ounce over other markets. And also in the precious metals, China approves registration of platinum and palladium futures. And that is Reuters. China has approved the registration of platinum and palladium futures and options, moving a step closer to the launch of the derivatives trading of the metals used by automakers and other industrial sectors. The China Securities Regulatory Commission said on Friday that it would supervise the Guangzhou Futures Exchange to ensure a smooth launch of platinum and palladium futures and options. The regulator did not disclose a date for the launch. So a continuing development and maturation, one might say, of the precious metals markets in China, just an ongoing theme. Continuing on, key African copper trade route reopens between Zambia and Tanzania. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com on November 5th. Tanzania has reopened its border with Zambia, restoring cargo flows along a key trade corridor for Africa's two biggest copper exporters after post-election unrest brought consignments to a standstill last week. The situation normalized on Monday, Oliver Nzala, corporate communications manager at the Zambia Revenue Authority, said by phone Wednesday. The border authorities are working on reducing the backlog, clearing on average 250 trucks daily in each direction, he added. Tanzania's main port of Dar es Salaam, a crucial hub for copper and cobalt shipments from mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia to China, also serves as a key fuel import terminal for the region. Unrest has eased since President Samia Suluhu Hassan was sworn in on Monday, following a disputed election that was marred by violence. Continuing on, copper output from Codelco slipped 7% in September. That is Reuters via mining.com. Copper production from Chilean state-run miner Codelco slid more than 7% in September. Data from the Copper Commission Cochilco showed on Monday falling to 115,000 tons. Meanwhile, production at BHP's Escondida mine, the world's largest copper mine, climbed nearly 17% to 118,000 tons. At Collahuasi, another major copper mine jointly run by Glencore and Anglo American, output fell 26% to 38,000 tons. And just a headline here for your information, which you can read further on mining.com. Teck had on-off talks with rival partner to Anglo for 2 years. That is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Continuing on, top candidate in Peru vows to revoke key mining industry rights. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. A conservative presidential hopeful in Peru is vowing a major change in policy, representing the key mining industry's biggest fear, to revoke key exploration permits for idle projects and redistribute them. The proposal is the bane of global mining corporations that operate in Peru since they increasingly battle for control of mineral-rich territory with informal actors. Companies condemn them as illegal miners, while small-scale diggers accuse them of hoarding land for decades without exploiting it. Quote, idle areas will revert to the state if they are not used by the formal mining industry, said Rafael Lopez Aliaga, a former mayor of Lima known as Porky. The fact that Lopez Aliaga made those remarks at the annual CADE Business Forum, the country's most exclusive gathering for local executives, will be a hard pill to swallow for the mining industry and suggests other candidates may follow suit. Peru is the world's number 3 copper producer and a key producer of gold, silver, and zinc. Continuing on, USGS officials add copper, silver to critical minerals mix. And this is by a staff writer at mining.com. The United States has added copper and silver to an expanded list of critical minerals that it deems to be vital to America's economic and national security. The new list, compiled by the U.S. Geological Survey, includes 10 additions to the previous one in 2022, taking the total to 60. The other notable additions are uranium, metallurgical coal, potash, rhenium, silicon, and lead. The addition of copper and silver confirms the earlier draft list proposed by the USGS. Continuing on, Tesla co-founder's critical minerals plant starts production. This is Bloomberg News on November 6th. Redwood Materials, a battery recycling venture led by Tesla Inc. co-founder J.B. Straubel, has begun operations at a $3.5 billion factory in South Carolina that will supply badly needed critical materials. Taking into account Redwood's existing recycling plants in Sparks, Nevada, which recovers 60,000 tons of critical minerals annually, the firm says it is now the only major domestic source of cobalt and produces as much nickel and lithium as the largest mines in the United States. And this is a whole other huge theme that we're seeing develop here, which is recycling. And finally, a pretty interesting development in the diamond market. Botswana president reiterates plan to buy majority of De Beers. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com. Botswana's president reiterated his plan to acquire a majority stake in De Beers as Anglo American looks to offload its controlling interest in the iconic diamond company. Quote, government will leverage a majority stake, Duma Boko said Monday in an annual address in Botswana's capital, Gaborone. Quote, concrete steps are underway towards the acquisition of Anglo American shares in De Beers. Anglo is divesting its 85% shareholding in De Beers as part of a sweeping restructuring that began almost 18 months ago. Botswana, which owns the rest of the company, relies on diamonds for about 80% of its exports. So continuing developments here in the diamond industry, fascinating to watch. Those are your news stories. Now, let's take a look at metal prices. And turning to metal prices, let's take a quick look at the bond market for context. The U.S. 10-year bond is yielding 4.12%. That is 0.03% higher than last week. The UK 10-year gilt is yielding 4.42%. That is unchanged from last week. The Italy 10-year bond is yielding 3.42%. That is up 0.02% on the week. France's 10-year bond is unchanged at 3.44%, but still yielding more than Italy's 10-year bond for the third week in a row. Germany's 10-year Bund is yielding 2.67%. That is 0.02% higher on the week. Japan's 10-year bond is unchanged at 1.7%, so consolidating at higher levels. And China's 10-year bond is yielding 1.81%. That is 0.07% higher on the week. So the biggest move really with China's 10-year bond, but dramatically lower in yield than all of the other bond markets that we are covering here. Turning to precious metals, gold is trading at $4,140.90 per ounce. That is $138 higher than last week, so gold recovering nicely. After dropping below $4,000, silver is trading at $50.66 per ounce. That is $3.16 higher than last week, so big recovery in silver, back above $50. Platinum is trading at $1,589.10 per ounce. That is $22 higher than last week. And palladium is trading at $1,440.50 per ounce. That is $10 lower than last week. Turning to industrial metals, copper is trading at $5.08 per pound. That is 5 cents higher than last week. Iron ore is trading at $103.34 per metric ton. That is $2 lower than last week. Aluminum is trading at $1.31 per pound. That is a penny lower than last week. Lead is trading at 94 cents per pound. That is 2 cents higher than last week. Nickel is slightly lower at $6.86 per pound. That is a penny lower than last week and still below $7 for the fifth week in a row. Tin is trading at $16.25 per pound. That is 12 cents lower than last week, but still above $16. Cobalt is unchanged at $22.03 per pound, and so staying at elevated levels. Lithium is trading at $11.34 per kilogram. That is 4 cents lower than last week. Uranium is trading at $77.45 per pound. That is $5 lower than last week. And zinc is trading at $1.40 per pound. That is a penny lower than last week. So gold, silver, and platinum recover, while industrial metals edge sideways, and those are your metal prices. Coming up, I'm very pleased to welcome to the program for the very first time Ian London, Executive Director of the Canadian Critical Minerals and Materials Alliance. We discuss the major pain points in the supply chain, particularly in Canada, and what policymakers can do to encourage and foster the production of minerals and metals in the country, and really the approach that should be taken. Should it be an all-of-the-above approach, or should it be more targeted, as Ian London is saying? It's a wonderful, in-depth discussion from a true expert. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you on the other side. Join us today. I'm very pleased to welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast for the very first time, Ian London, Executive Director of the Canadian Critical Minerals and Materials Alliance. Ian, welcome to the show.
Thank you kindly for the invite, and look forward to the chatting with you over the next while.
So you are with the Canadian Critical Minerals and Materials Alliance, the C2M2A. Were you involved in the mining industry at all before this? In a sense, do you consider yourself in the mining industry now? Could you give us just a little bit of background on, in a sense, how you got to where you are as Executive Director of C2M2A?
First of all, lucky, but let me go back a little bit. Actually, a graduate in engineering and metallurgy, back from McGill back in the early 1970s, but have never really practiced metallurgy. Got involved more on the business side, eventually in most of my career on the power side, but when I talk about the power side, working with the Ontario Hydros of the world in that electricity sector, involved in the procurement end of things. Was the chief negotiator for the equipment for Bruce Darlington nuclear power stations, the Glace Bay heavy water plants, and those. I dealt with a lot of manufacturers of major equipment. So it continued with this materials dimension. How do we get zirconium for pressure tubes? How do we get major manufacturers for some of these devices? Then got involved with engineered components for building, retired from hydro days, heading up the international arm for many years, got involved in engineered fasteners and components for building steam generators, major mining trucks, X-ray machines and MRI machines. Wait a minute, all advanced manufacturing. which involves materials. So for my metallurgy days early on, from minerals into the material side. And when I retired from that side, got involved on the rare earth sector. Knew a couple of folks who kind of roped me in. I was intrigued by, and this is back in the early 2000s, where China was going economically, where North America was going, based on some of these advanced materials. And China's advanced economy, driven by rare earths at the time. Oh, we can make rare earths. Wait a minute, we can sell you raw materials. Then the Chinese said, nah, we're going to sell you processed materials. And eventually the Chinese said, nah, we'll sell you magnets. And now you and I buy their washing machines, the cars, the air dryers. They did the whole manufacturing, economic manufacturing stream, all materials based. That's how I got here. Eventually got to know a number of folks, and as you'll find, I'm not the shyest commentator in the world. So ended up pulling together these group of companies and a whole stream. It's not just the end material. Helium was a critical material. Why helium? Used as an environment by which to make semiconductors. So you look at the periodic table, what are all the ingredients to build economies?
What I really like about your description is you describe China building their whole supply chain from the bottom up, it sounds like, and from the raw materials to the processed metal to the magnets and so on. And so I guess, the first, omnipresent question that, is like a cloud in my mind as you're describing this is, did you see this coming? Because I feel like a lot of us kind of saw this coming, this kind of, some senators are even calling it a critical minerals crisis. It seems like this has been kind of obvious, actually, for a couple of decades, and that it's only now that it's actually a problem, and that this abstraction of this problem has now become a practical reality now that we feel it. In other words, our manufacturers no longer have what they need, that it's becoming a, quote unquote crisis. Did you see this coming? It seems like you would have.
The answer is yes, and I can show you proceedings I've had with Finance, Natural Resources Canada, the Magnets Association. Yes, you could see it coming. No question. You have to go back even to 2010, which is only 15 years ago, when China put embargoes on Japan, on magnet materials, because of some political incident, and the Japanese economy panicked. So the answer is yes, we all knew it was coming. We've already actually said we have to do something about it, but we're complacent, especially Canadians. We're complacent. Then again, like this whole word, the Americans complacent. It's a big issue, but we could deal with it. We'll bring in tariffs. We'll bring in this. You know, eventually people will move here. Well, no. While we're talking about it, and we've talked about it for let's say 20 years. You know what our friends in the East have done? They implemented 4 5-year plans. So we've debated for 20 years, and they've implemented 4 5-year plans. Now, it's actually more than 20 years. They've actually implemented 6 5-year plans. But there's underlying issues. Canada had, like I said before, Canada has the resources, it has the talent pools, it has the capability. So does the whole West. We like low prices. We like, quarterly results. No disrespect to my friends in the finance community and the investors. That's not an industrial strategy. Matter of fact, in many of our, and no disrespect to junior miners, it's great. I got the biggest property in the whole world, and it's great. My share price went from a dime to 50 cents, and then they sell. No, 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 no. Industry is built on production. Industry is built on product, not on look how valuable that dirt is. So we saw it coming. We knew it was coming. Our economic models aren't there. Our industrial strategy isn't clearly articulated. Now you're starting to hear some things coming out of the U.S. government, out of the, unfortunately, we have to use, they're using a war kind of or a defense dimension. Canada's coming out with an industrialist strategy, which it never really had. But we also have to change some of our economic outlook. You're not going to get returns every quarter. We're building a 30-year plan. This is a transition of an economy. It doesn't happen on Tuesdays or Wednesdays. Slogging, failures, many successes.
I mean, it's tempting to read that, though. Like, are we almost being forced into adopting a kind of state driven economy, because if we don't, in a sense, China has shown that they're willing to just subsidize, for example, metal processing, one of your specialties. And so it feels like we're being forced, and maybe overgeneralizing perhaps with a state driven economy, but we are being pushed in that direction, are we not?
It's not just China. Let's go back a step. Japan Inc., Korea Inc., our Western private, independent free markets, maybe it's centuries are behind us. And now to drive some of the stuff is going to take private enterprise. Governments cannot drive this. No disrespect to our government friends. They can enable it, but we need the industrialists to sit there. Here are the opportunities. Here's how we implement. And government, through state ownership or getting some return on investment, have to actively participate. They're the enablers. In Canada, and I hate saying this, we've got quite comfortable. We're waiting for the government to take action. Oh, maybe they'll put in the first dollar. Time out. No. Industry has to lead it. Governments now in this situation must enable it. Simplify regulations, make a capital investment, simplify some of the tax rules, etc. Maybe, and what you now see in the States, negotiating floor prices, offtake agreements. Once you have an offtake agreement going to the government, you're state involved. That's the way you're going to build the economy or transition it. We just can't sit back and wait. So it's not just, like I said, just China encouraging it. The economic returns, no longer quarterly results. How's my quarter doing? Well, sorry, this is a 10-year implementation or a 20-year implementation plan. As a matter of fact, I'm going to take a little segue. Let's look at a supply chain. Has a number of stages in it. Who said our Chinese friends were making money on the mining? Who said they're making a dime on the processing? Who said they're making $1 on assemblies? I can tell you, they're making $1 on every car they sell, or new jobs they created, or the universities that got built around those rare earth mines, which are developing the next generation technologies. That is the return on investment, not our traditional, what has been traditionally accepted in this country. And it served us well for 100 years or 200 years. It's not a criticism of the past. What will it take to go forward?
Indeed. And so you mentioned that we have the talent here. I want to say it's a bit of an open question as far as the rare earths, but you'd be more learned on this than I would. Let's just say, in theory, hypothetically, we have the talent and the knowledge that can match China's, 20, 30 years of development on this issue. Can we compete on cost? Because to me, this seems to be perhaps an even greater challenge in the sense that can we produce copper? Can we produce these rare earths at the same cost that they do? And if we can't, are we not simply just pushing the problem up to manufacturers or maybe the magnet makers or the car makers who then have to pay more and then won't be able to compete? Or am I just going too far here?
Look, there are real cost pressures. There's no question. In terms of are we going to be able to match our costs? No. But if we don't work out some sort of mechanisms, now there are going to be trade barriers or content rules may be required to encourage this stuff. Why are we competing with them on the same product? We can also compete them on next generation products. But let's come back to the cost. Where's the return? It may not be at the mine level. It may be here. It may be on the recycling side. There are returns and financial returns that in aggregate, this is an economic investment. Or developing the talent pool based on projects being in operation, developing the next generation of motors, robots. We don't have to do it sequentially and in the same order they did. Is it going to be a challenge price-wise? Yes, no question. Until they don't supply, and then we have nothing. So we all have to adapt our own economies with our trading partners and saying, okay, what's important to us? Are we always going to be the consumer of goods and nobody generating wealth? Well, generating wealth has a return for the health and welfare of the country. So again, a different kind of argument rather than just on unit price. Now, that also means changing industry. And some of my colleagues in the automotive industry Their whole incentive program is last year, if I bought it for $1, this year I get a bonus if I can buy it for 99 cents. Oh, and my next year's bonus because I'm going to target it down to 98 cents. Well, maybe we can't do it. Or maybe, and I look back at some of these rare earth products, out of a total dollar value of a car, the amount of rare earth is peanuts. So why are we looking at the cost, the unit cost of dysprosium? I got a 4,000 pound vehicle and I'm using a kilogram of this stuff. That's not going to drive the cost of the car. It's robotics, it's the way you build things and other costs.
Very interesting. So, in a sense, concerns around a price floor for these materials, because of course it's price controls and this sort of thing, but you would say, look, that's okay in the sense that, let's say in the case of automobiles, to use a specific example, because look, it's not a huge, like if we have to pay double the amount of dysprosium because of price floors, well, what's your alternative, Mr. Pocobelli? Would you like to have no dysprosium because China doesn't like us today?
I'm just throwing these arguments out for
Right.
for this conversation, but that's what you're faced with. And you're right. We have to set floor prices because if you're going to raise some private equity, not just government funding, private capital, et cetera, some of their drivers are still on based on return. So somebody has to underwrite some of the risk. But you can see that's a different economic model than we've ever used, or we haven't used in a long while. And it becomes much more complex. So not only do we need it technically, we also need the young finance business folks and policymakers who understand this is a different economy we're involved with.
Okay, excellent. So we've kind of laid things out here a little bit. And so I'm curious, how, from your perspective, is Canada doing? Are we making the right moves as a country? How is the West doing? I mean, start wherever you want in that, but in a sense, it seems like we're going in the direction that you would be advocating. What do you think?
It is making the moves. It's not fast enough and it's not bold enough for me. And I always use this as a slight example, and you can take it as humorous. I'm 75 years old and I want to be at a ribbon cutting. So let's get on with this.
Yes.
Okay. But it actually says something. We've got to get on with it. One of the issues we have difficulties with is we say it's a critical material space. We know that Canada and its partners only have so much dollars around, but we still open these things up for tender saying, put all your project proposals forward and the government will help, sift through the better ones. Well, no, they're not going to be able to. What is the better ones? We have a natural tendency to say, well, we have 3 territories and 10 provinces, so we'll give a little bit to everybody. Is it going to be copper, lithium, cobalt, graphite, et cetera? So let's spread all the money around. When you only have a small pot, you got to pick some. So one of the things that I would like to see and have suggested on more than one occasion, but it's difficult for folks, how do we put some of the senior, I know how to go about it, how do we put together a blue ribbon type panel of CEOs, tech guys in the tech and the manufacturing side from a number of different sectors, go in a room and you tell me the 5 to 10 key projects that I could bring into production will make a buck. And if your project's not in it, I don't care. For one, these would be the best. And that's recommended to the government. Two, related to that, I make it a requirement saying, okay, we're not taking this oil and gas project. We're going to build a rare earth one. You could do it in reverse. Oil and gas guy, we'll incent you, but I want 100 of your engineers and technicians to be trained to run that rare earth plant. But I want you to start today. How do we start upskilling the staff so when that rare earth or battery or graphite or AI, whatever the new opportunity is, how do we ensure that we have talent pools ready to operate in that entirely new environment? You can't learn this stuff in school. So I'm now taking advantage of existing industries, Petrosar out of the chemical industry. What's the difference between the chemical industry and making some of these advanced processed rare earth lithium products? They're chemical plants / metallurgical plant. No, you have a science background, you have a processing background. How do we then encourage those who may not have their project booming, ready and able to run those new projects? Now that may take industry to who can, when I say find industry leadership, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to pick 5 projects. One of them will be a failure. My general feeling is governments don't like picking failures. They don't like picking for winners either, but living with failures. Well, some of these industry leaders, many of them, that's how they got to be industry leaders. They failed on a couple. So it's a public-private approach, but industry has to bring them forward. And don't invite 100 projects to the table because you're not going to get 100. You're going to get 200 projects because everybody has one. This one has flow through, and I got $10 million in the bank, and I have this $1 billion project. Great. You're not it this week. You may be the secondary ring. Start on the midstream. Don't start at the mine, start at the midstream. We can import materials, process. Why midstream? To be brought into production much sooner, less costly, shorter implementation schedules. Raw materials are available from all kinds of sorts. Look at our aluminum industry. Maybe you can tell me how many bauxite plants we have in this country. None. Why? Inexpensive, clean power. That is the key to that industry. So those are the kind of factors. It's a short list. Those are the projects to bring into production in the nearer term. And that would demonstrate to our partners and customers that Canada is in the business. Right now, we're in the process, and I'm being a little on the extreme side, and my apologies to the mining associations and the PDACs, et cetera. End users don't buy aspirations. They buy tons, pounds, numbers of components.
Now, the focus seems to be from 20,000 feet in the air. We've seen most of the investment go into mining projects. I guess we could say with MP Materials. In the US, it seems to be a little bit towards processing. And there's also an emphasis on what I call specialty minerals, because it seems like critical minerals has become almost everything. And it kind of almost is all critical. I mean, I imagine you'd kind of agree with that, right? I mean, what metal don't we need, right?
Exactly.
So I guess the first part of the question is, should we be focusing more on processing? Like, in a sense, is that our real bottleneck here? Is processing, and is that the real strength we need, or is it both?
We need new raw material supply in this country. There's no question. But that's a 10 or 20-year horizon. MP Materials is actually, they were an operating mine. They were the world leaders under its Molycorp days in rare earths. They were building processing plants. They are now funding processing facilities. Disappointingly, or fortunately, the Canadians and Australians are building them in the States. A Nova Scotia company, Nucor, is building a refinery in Louisiana. Now, they're also contemplating or building one in Kingston now, or at least talking about it. Cyclic materials, recycling rare earth containing products, computers, etc. U.S. operations. So Canadian companies are building in the U.S. Processors. Well, because the U.S. are putting in big dollars. They're fortunate to have a Department of Defense with huge allocations. They could do things we can't normally or easily. And let's be honest, if copper is becoming the big issue, maybe that's where we put our mining dollars today. We can't do all the material. Graphite. Graphite's one of the more important, and Canada has resources and some processing capacities here. Okay, maybe we forget the rare earths for a while, or lithium. Maybe we lighten up on the lithium, et cetera, and get those graphite operated. Get something in operation. Cobalt. So I'm dancing around a bit because I don't want to support any one of my members or not members of the association. But all I'm suggesting is we got to pick where we're going to put our effort and then get them into production. And you're right, we may sacrifice, we're always going to have to sacrifice something. Welcome to economies. But we can't do it all. And my concern in Canada is we tend to want to do everything geographically or technically. None of these projects are going to be easy. The mines will come. What is the problem with the mines? They need somebody to take the mineral. They need a buyer for the mineral. Right now, there are many mines who said, if I had somebody to take an offtake agreement, I could open up this project. But the bankers won't step in unless they know you can move the material. So what are we doing here? Well, maybe we build the midstream, and the midstream will have a customer. The midstreams, they know because they're now in a products business, not a mine development business. They will secure customers, and that builds the chain both ways, upstream and downstream.
So ultimately then, say from a country perspective, in, we could say, Canada, even the US or Australia, a country should look at their strengths from a mineral point of view. What do you have, right? What are your strongest projects? And perhaps they should then build the processing facilities for those projects, so to speak, or for what you have the greatest strengths for. What do you think of that?
Well, I would add one dimension you missed. What do end customers are going to want? Not what we have, what will they need? So the question arises, is it going to be energy storage devices for electric vehicles? Or is it going to be magnets for robotics? Are we building major AI centers and power generators? You look at AI. I sit and talk to a couple of the, my kids' friends and all that kind of stuff. And oh, AI software, look what it could do. AI are computing centers. AI takes tons of electricity, right? I got to run these things. So maybe our asset is we can build AI centers and processing centers, et cetera. So what are the components they need we can supply? I'm only playing that as a theme. I'm not trying to judge. Maybe it's in
Sure.
robotics. EVs, well, we actually don't build them, and people are taking those EVs out of this country. Maybe to get an EV manufacturer, one, you have to support EVs. So taking off tariffs, taking off incentives don't necessarily help. The Americans are taking the auto industry away from us. How do I replace it? And if they're not going to be here, maybe that's not the product we supply. I'm just playing around with some of the streams. So I would add the customer demand side into your equation. This is what the industry is going to. Here is the resources we have. Here's the processing capacity we need. Get the processing capacity and build it out both ways. It does not have to be done linearly, especially since the mining has a long lead time, right? Opening a new mine traditionally has taken 10 to 20 years. Am I going to wait 10 or 20 years before we get into this business? I don't think that's the wisest.
Right. So these initial decisions, then, deciding what we are going to build out rather than just kind of spraying the money all across the entire sector, these are key decisions, aren't they? And so
Yeah,
you would agree then, once we determine what those projects might be that are going to be useful for this new economy that's coming, you do agree that we should have then build out the processing for those.
absolutely. 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 Build the processing. Feedstocks are available or can be accelerated if we have a couple that might feed it, like a graphite mine or a graphite production. Yes, maybe that's the one. Can we line up customers? Yes. Maybe it's the Europeans, maybe it's the Americans, but we got to get on with it. And in some cases, where I look at some of the industry leadership required, we will not necessarily have all the pieces in place by the time you have to make your decision. Welcome to the reality.
Right. Welcome to real business reality. I mean, if you're going to enter business as a government, unfortunately, you're going to have the same kind of risks.
But industry leaders should be able to deal with that risk and tolerate it.
Right.
Government's going to need to enable it and make and de-risk some of it for the private sector to actually invest in it. Or end customers saying, Canada's actually serious. They can provide this.
Right. And even have you might say, the rhetorical defense for when something goes down and say, look, that's the cost of doing business, folks. Like, that's what we have to do here, and not go, okay, start pointing fingers at whomever
Well,
and say, no,
forget, yeah,
it means we're on the right track. Actually, if something went down, it means we're doing stuff here.
right. I look at the battery plants Canada awarded some, got involved with a number of months back or years back. I remember asking some business guy, of the billions of dollars we're putting into it, how much is going into building the upstream? Oh, that's a good idea. It's more than a good idea. You're going to build a plant, you don't have a feedstock. You got to think in these terms. Do you have an end customer? Oh yeah, electric vehicles. We just took the incentive off of buying electric vehicles. The sales here of electric is going to drop. It's going to soften. So they're not thinking, or I don't see the sense. It's not apparent to me that that's the kind of thinking or business decisions that are being made. Now, you're going to have to factor it in and say, look, I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. But I would argue that if you're putting billions into battery plants, you would incent the use of batteries.
It sounds like we're going to need a whole new level of engagement and, dare I say, sophistication from our governments out here. in the West that I'm not sure, as I hear what's required from you. Like, I hope they're up to the task. I think we all hope. But I mean, this is going to require kind of a whole new level of engagement intellectually, I would argue.
Yeah, it is different, but I think the West is getting their head around it. They are getting their heads around it. Things are moving. And I think the minister the new minister comes from that sector, and has come with a business background. There's a lot to ponder. We got to lighten up on the government's going to make some of these decisions or how we're going to do it. That becomes complicated. But like I suggested, there are ways of putting some of these blue ribbon. When I say blue ribbon panel, I mean locking 10 CEOs up in a room for a weekend and come up with an answer. You've made these decisions before, or what's going to be, and you got to stand behind it because you now own it. Well, I don't know if I want to own it. Well, we're giving you another incentives all over the place in terms of tax rules or environmental or whatever. You start talking about a critical material crisis or critical material wars. That's what we're into. This is what we're facing. You stop shipping certain products. Weren't they shipping cars a little while back, not fully built? They were missing some of the semiconductors. So they sold the vehicle and you have to bring it back because certain features didn't work because we didn't have the semiconductors. But you don't want to shut down till you get all your parts. You got to continue. Otherwise, it's like a building. You lock up a cottage for 6 months. You don't lock up buildings. They die. You don't lock up the economy. They die. You close a mine, tough to reopen a mine. I'm not discounting what our success has been in the past, but the world was different for the last 150 years. It served us well. The lumber industry and all these they were all very traditional. Hewers of wood, drawers of water to work. We live a comfortable life, and look at us chatting today. I'm now worried about the next generation, ours today and the next generation.
I assume you saw the Canadian budget that was tabled on November 4th. I mean, do you have a reaction, a response on what you saw?
Right direction, in terms of looks at government investment. It addresses some of the things we're talking about. Here's some of our advantages. Here's some of the incentives we could build in. You get a little lost when you get to the detail. We have added 12 more elements that could be acceptable for these tax credits, and we added 5 more critical materials. But like you said, I got 32, 33, 34. Now it's at 30. Everything is critical. It's coming down to decision time and saying, what's the best opportunities for Canada and its trading partners, because I don't think we'll fill out all the supply chain. And how do we get on with it? That's the key. That's still not there. I see that there's 50 odd $million in the budget, which talks about how we're going to start designing and managing some of these funds. Yeah, don't waste 5 years. Don't waste $50 million. I know of one organization that can actually start doing this stuff now. Government doesn't have to do it. We have to find a mechanism of working with government because they're also the protector of the significant funds required. But they're enabling funds. They don't have to decide on them. They don't have to determine which is the best one. They're going to go through
Right.
year-long tenders. That's not going to get us to where we're going to. How do we get a blue ribbon panel of sorts? This is the kind of projects we need. These are the projects we need. Here's the kind of dollars required. And we support it. Now you support it.
Right. And go with it and go tomorrow. Like, start putting your shovel in the ground and, like, here's our experts. They have 4 weeks to figure it out. Tell us the 6 projects we're gonna, and then they can come back to us with the next 6.
And it's
like
a processing, and it's a processing facility. And I'm going to pick, Timbuktu, Quebec. It needs a plot of land and needs electric power. Good. The local government, here's your plot of land. Premier, make a phone call to Hydro-Quebec or Ontario Hydro or Ontario Power Generator Hydro, and you're putting in a power line. Well, we have to study it. We study everything.
As we start to wrap up here, so of course there was Glencore, there was discussion. I mean, with all of the effort that is being made to, encourage metal production and processing, then we hear Glencore, the Horn smelter, that, we're not sure if we're going to be able to do this anymore. We hear in Australia, I think it was Rio Tinto with an aluminum production facility. We don't know if we're going to be able to do this. And understandably, I mean, power costs are high, and this stuff takes, congealed electricity, as they call it.
Yep.
What's going on here? What do we do?
I don't know the details of the particular scenario, but I've read what's in the papers, etc. And I'm not underestimating the rational reasons for it. Is it important to this country That's the company's articulation. I'm not sure it adds up for us. Well, if it adds up for the country through a third party of, senior executives saying, yeah, it makes sense, or we need it, or maybe they're right. Should we underwrite the project and throw in more money to make it more economic for them? I don't know. I'm going to leave some of that judgment to folks much smarter than I. Those are the kind of dynamics everybody's going to preach the same. I don't have the money. I can't do it. Or the competition's tough. If there's an advantage of building it here in this country, and what do you need to do it? And they're already in operations, maybe we have to do it. I'll leave that to the panel of the smart ones. But it's a matter of getting on with it. So back to your original question, is the budget in the right direction? Yes. Lots of words, lots of complexity to it. But we do have to find a mechanism. How do you translate it into actual work? When you start feeling 2040 is a long time away. We have $5 billion. Really? I think, what did the US government put into Molycorp? 400 million? Or MP materials. And not only that, Apple, and I don't know this at all, Apple right after that, put in $500 million. And now they're funded.
Right. And in a sense, like almost to your earlier point, like these are still drops in the bucket when we're talking about the entire supply chain here. Like, and it seems like every week we're getting a zero put behind, so we are going in the right direction to your point. Molycorp or, MP Materials. I remember Molycorp. I was an investor in Molycorp back in 2010. Didn't work out actually so much because they went bankrupt there. Ultimately, though, like it seems like we're going in the right direction because, one week it's $400 million. The next week it's $5 billion. And then we start seeing like $50 billion. And then we see like the JP Morgan, $1 trillion. So things are moving in the right direction, it seems.
Yes.
So as we wrap up here, here's one of my concerns that I see as I, track this beat pretty closely and have followed it since 2012, really, actually even before when I was going to say since I started working at the Northern Miner, but even before when I was investing in the rare earths. I remember the Japanese incident with the fishing boats and all that. One of the things that I'm wondering about, and I'm curious to hear your response to as we wrap up here, is we're seeing a lot of attention put on, again, what I call the specialty minerals, the rare earths, samarium, these military, and, for good reason. I mean, if you can't build missiles.
Gallium, you can name them all.
Gallium, germanium, right. And very important for military applications. And so if you don't have a military, then all sorts of other problems start to happen. But my concern is, are we almost missing the forest for the trees here? Or like, what about the industrial metals, which seem like kind of a potentially much bigger fire or concern on the horizon here? If all of a sudden, what if we're not talking about not having enough dysprosium, but we're talking about not having enough copper?
Absolutely. I totally agree because, copper needed by the utilities. How am I going to get power to some of these places? I totally agree that critical materials has captured the imaginations in terms of every newscaster, every article, even what's prompted this group, this conversation today. Yeah, there's a certain glimmer to it. There's a certain shot. Maybe it is copper. Maybe it is nickel. Well, if it's nickel and copper, we gave up those industries too. No, we've got to make some tough choices. And we should not necessarily give up on the others. Aluminum, big energy producer, maybe we expand it. Now what you see with Rio Tinto, where we have to accelerate the scandium industry so I can make lightweight aluminum strong products for defense, automotive, etc. That's the kind of strategic discussion saying, okay, yes, copper, yes, this. Now, one of the issues one has to look at, some of the novel technologies have lots of manufacturing jobs associated with and high-tech jobs for low volume input, of some of these critical materials. Is that an advantage to this country? One would look at that case. It's possible there's a greater return and the next generation of computing centers, et cetera. You will need copper. You will need. Could we compete with, our Chilean friends or our Peruvian friends in copper? Can we compete with lithium coming out of Australia? I don't know. Rare earths? I'll be honest. I'm not sure we're in the rare earth mining business. The Linuses of the world, the MPs of the world, our friends in Southeast Asia, maybe they're in the mining side, but they're not manufacturers. They're not car builders. They're not robot builders. Now, given time, and if we continue to wait, they will be, because they will take, wait a minute, I have the raw material, I have the process material. I can now go the next step and be the assemblers. And what Canada, And West of the West has to do is nab that part net because we're capable of doing it. And we have a strong industrial base. We have automakers or big industrial or robot makers. We have that capability. We're great. Canada, I didn't realize how high Canada's rated as an AI center in the world. Well, maybe that's where we should do it. Like I said, I'm not trying to pick any one particular sector, just building up. So there are some tough decisions to be made. Maybe it's oil and gas the next was a while and take full advantage of that. So, like I said, budget's in the right direction, changing off some of the environmental. If we not lightening them, but maintaining the value, but making it less restrictive and simpler to operate, because our goal has to be towards the industrialization. Make products here. We shouldn't have to wait for tariffs on certain components, which says I can build a whole device except for that magic component, which I can't across the border, or through tariffs is 5 times the cost. Not 1 time the cost, or 10 times the cost, or you can't get it at all. Then we have nothing.
Any brief final thoughts for us, Ian?
Canada, be bold. We can do it. And I think that's come out of the budget also. It's long overdue to be bold. We can band together and get it done, and look forward to continuing discussion with the likes of yourself. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
We're going to have you back, and I think sooner rather than later. Ian London, Executive Director of the Canadian Critical Minerals and Materials Alliance. Thank you for joining us. I really enjoyed our conversation. We had a pretty long interview, and I felt like we were just getting started here.
Enjoyed it immensely. Thank you for your time.
Thank you once again to Pear Tree Canada for sponsoring this week's episode of the Northern Miner Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit peartreecanada.com. And thank you once again to Ian London for appearing on this week's episode. And thank you, dear listener, for continuing to support this program. If you want to help out the podcast, please leave us a review in the Apple Podcast directory. Share it with your friends. And until next week, take care.